they fit in.
Do you accept the idea of systemic racism?
I think systemic racism, ever since the concept was born in the book Black Power in 1967, has always been confusing, because it was originally called institutional racism, and it was created in contrast to what was called individual racism. So the idea was you have individual racists. These are people who have bias in their minds or hearts, and you have racist policies, like Jim Crow policies in the South. But then we have this other thing that's much more subtle. It's called systemic racism, and it's not located in the individuals or the policies, but in the quote-unquote system. And even if you read the first articulation of the concept, it's clear that there's some confusion behind it. Because if it's not in the individuals and it's not in the policies, it's not clear that there really is a third place for the racism to be located. So I would argue that there's a conceptual problem with systemic racism to begin with. And aside from the conceptual problem, there's an empirical problem. There are several empirical problems. One is that generally the studies used to justify the notion that the US has a systemic racism problem are taking big categories like blacks and whites, comparing them on some mean statistic, finding some difference, and then ascribing that to systemic racism. One problem with that is blacks and whites are different groups with different histories, different demographics, different average ages, and when you control for that, some of that stuff will go away. The second problem is that even when you can control for everything that's measurable, there are all kinds of huge and important immeasurable differences between people. So even if you think you're comparing like with like, so we're just going to look at 25-year-old black men and 25-year-old white men, both from two-parent households who live in Wisconsin. And why is it the case that black men are incarcerated I'm just making this up, but at X times the rate of the white men? Isn't that systemic racism? Well, no, not necessarily, because there are all kinds of relevant differences that can't be measured with numbers, like culture, habits, customs, values, desires. And we should notice that we're not tempted to do this in many areas. We're not tempted to look at the fact that 20% of postal workers are black, or 3/4 of the NBA is black, and jump to the conclusion that there's a systemic bias towards black people in those cases. So what I would say is people are far, in addition to there being a conceptual problem, there's just a huge literature that's founded on the presumption that in the absence of bias, groups would achieve identical outcomes, and there's no reason to support that assumption. That said, individual racism is certainly real, and I don't ever expect it to go away. And the other caveat I would give is that there are certain rare instances where I think the notion of systemic racism is useful. For example, there was a study recently that showed court stenographers routinely messed up in transcribing the speech of black defendants and of black people testifying in court. And black stenographers and white stenographers were both equally likely to mess up. So this is a notion where it's not that these people were individually biased against black people. It was just hearing African American vernacular, they were worse at transcribing it in a way that redounded to the detriment of black people disproportionately. So there, it's not a policy, it's not quite an individual anti-black bias. So in those rare instances, I do think the notion of systemic racism is justified. But what's interesting is not how many such examples there are, but how few.
I mean, race is certainly one of the most polarizing topics and one of the hottest topics in American culture. Do you feel an obligation to use your words extremely carefully?
Yes, I do, because I want to get my point across without being needlessly inflammatory. I don't enjoy making people angry. I'm actually a rather conflict-averse person by nature, which I know people won't believe, but it's true. So I try not to inflame any more than I need to make a point. Because what I've learned is when I say things that seem totally commonsensical and rational to me, sometimes that causes a shitstorm, at least in my Twitter bubble, which admittedly is a very, very small corner of the world that in the grand scheme of things doesn't matter all that much. But yeah, I do feel a responsibility to be careful with. There are many different ways to make the same point. You can make it with a variety of formulations that range from pointed and clickbaity to overly academic and hidden behind jargon. And it's certainly more art than a science to find where in that spectrum you fit. But I do my best.
And what's the reaction been to the articles, mostly online?
I get everything from scholarly critiques of niche points that I've made to complete dismissals of me as a human being, as a sellout, and as an Uncle Tom who just wants to make white people feel good so that I can collect paychecks. And I get everything in between. And I tune most of the stuff on that end of the spectrum out because it's boring. And I get some legitimate critiques and a lot of praise as well. So I get the full spectrum.
One of the issues about the work that you're doing is that it would be very difficult. Like, we seem to be in a bit of a catch-22 situation at the moment where it would be very difficult for a white author to be making some of the points that you're making.
People are more liable to give me the benefit of the doubt because I happen to be black. They assume that A, I understand racism exists, and that B, I'm coming from a good place in terms of my internal intentions. And those two assumptions generally don't extend to white people who make the same points that I do. And that doesn't make sense to my brain, but I suppose there's a kind of logic to it. It's a kind of heuristic stereotyping logic, which goes, there are some legitimate racists. We do polls and we still find sometimes 5 or 10% of white people in this country agreeing with just outright racist claims. So when you hear a white person criticizing affirmative action, that could be a white supremacist, or it could be a political centrist or even a liberal who just has a particular perspective. And if you're trying to determine on a small amount of information which is which, you might just form a heuristic to say, assume they're all white supremacists if they're making noises that a white supremacist might make. And there's a kind of logic to that, and there's a kind of logic to treating whites and blacks differently there, but because a black person is very unlikely to be a white supremacist, so you're kind of forming a stereotype and a heuristic to play the odds. Of course, to some degree, people are doing this all the time. Everyone is stereotyping subtly all the time. But we know that we're not actually supposed to act on stereotypes. We're supposed to treat people as individuals. And we have taboos on stereotyping for a reason. It's only that those taboos become inactive when we're now discussing a white person who you're stereotyping as a racist because they have a nuanced grasp of affirmative action, or they don't think that they're concerned about racial crime disparities or what have you. So I think the strategy that should be employed there is to treat people as individuals regardless of what is true statistically of people who hold their view.
And you mentioned this before, that some of the criticism has been that you're making white people feel better, or and if we were to take a sort of more critical view, you've certainly had a very fast rise in terms of your success with the Quillette pieces and being invited onto Sam Harris and onto Dave Rubin. So a cynic might say you're being taken up by people who are just wanting to make white people feel better about the legacy of slavery, for example.
What I would say to that is it starts the story in the middle, because ever since the late 60s, there has been a powerful and loud group of intellectuals, writers, orators, who have been intentionally making white people feel guilty, keeping white people feeling as if they're on the hook for crimes that they did not commit, which on its face is a bizarre thing to do to a person, or a bizarre thing to suggest is rational, that you should feel shame for crimes that you had nothing to do with. What they would argue is that you benefit from it. America was built on the back of slavery, so how can you possibly exempt yourself from that legacy? And it's people who looked like you who perpetrated these. It was your ancestors, regardless of whether it actually was. The point is you benefit from it. So to start the story in the middle and say, well, Coleman, you're making white people feel less guilty for slavery and Jim Crow. Well, it's like, yeah, because they shouldn't have felt guilty for those things in the first place. I don't think guilt is a useful emotion or shame when you're talking about how to craft policy to make the majority of Americans flourish as much as possible. It's not clear to me why guilt is a useful emotion to throw into that discussion, because guilt is too powerful. Guilt is an extremely powerful emotion. It has not a unique power, but it's capable of shutting down reason to a degree that is really remarkable. And I don't mind if my writing makes white people feel less white guilt, because the whole idea of race pride and race guilt is corrupt to begin with. So I would agree with does my writing make people feel less guilty? Sure, that's fine. That's not my intention. My intention is just to make sense about race in America and to critique the way we talk about race and put forward alternative frameworks that are more useful. But if part of that entails people feeling less guilt, shame, or pride for the amount of melanin in their skin, then so much the better.